Just before we had to leave, Lisa pointed out, am I missing something? I don't use that one. In fact, I can barely get by with a keyboard. I mean, just give me the chalkboard and chalk, please. Anyway, so Lisa pointed out this morning that there were two mallards in our backyard, the drake and the hen. And does anybody know what that means? Bummer, because I need to know. I was hoping somebody would know, because I have no clue what that means. Grass is pretty long, so maybe it just meant it was comfortable or whatever. They sure were beautiful to see God's creation there, right in our backyard, small, and kind of surprising. Hey, last Sunday, I think it was, that you all submitted some sermon suggestions. Boy, did I appreciate those. Some were really thoughtful and good. A few I'd hoped to preach on anyway, and others I didn't think about that are very exciting. And on a Wednesday, I had about 30-some people hand in some surveys. I'm asking everybody, I don't know if anybody got them in the email, because I didn't email them to yesterday, but to give me some choices off the chart that I made for you, from 1 to 5 choices. Does anybody need one of those charts? Because I've got 2 men that have some extras. Anybody need one of the sermon survey preference charts? We're all good? All right. Well, I'm looking forward to getting those handed in then. It's been very interesting so far. Okay, well, that's look at the a very particular point in Jesus' life. About 6 months ago, we looked at his birth, and there are a lot of misunderstandings about that because people haven't read the Bible, but when they do, they're kind of surprised at what we see about the birth of Jesus. We don't know how many wise men there are, although we sing a song that there were 3, and most people think that the wise men showed up when Jesus was in the manger, in the barn type deal, and he wasn't. They came when he was about 2 years old. And well, anyway, we're moving right from then. I won't review much, to Luke chapter 2. And if you were able to track it all with the reading that Terry did, Jesus is now 12 years old. Here's the interesting thing. This is the only set of scriptures we have that tell us about Jesus between his infancy and when he was 30 years old. That's it, about 12, 13 verses. Otherwise, silence on his whole life up to the time that his ministry begins. And there's some things that perplexed me, so I decided to chew on it, and I hope I don't regret that. I definitely struggled a little bit, but we're going to dig into that. We're going to look at the concept is left behind. So have you ever, one of the most frightening times, and Lisa's in my marriage, how long ago was it? A little over 30 years ago was when we went to the Puyallup Fair. Lots of people, lots of restaurants, and we're thinking, what should we buy, And Laura's with us, and she's really shy, and so we're looking at the restaurants and look down and gone. Of course, there's 1.2 million people that visited a year. Divide that by 17, and over 100,000 people a day, and no Laura. And so we start looking. Of course, fear's in our hearts. We're praying. And I don't remember the details anymore. All I know is it took us 10 or 15 or longer minutes to find her. I don't know where she was. I just don't remember any of that stuff. But when we found her, it was so traumatic that once Lisa saw Laura, her knees buckled. We just buckled from the trauma, the experience. So compare that to losing God's Son. Compare that to being on a long journey, far from home, and just gone. You don't find him in 15 minutes or 15 hours. And that's the episode we're going to look at today. And there's a lot involved in this, but that was the reading that we had. So I'm just going to make sure I can use everything properly. And I'll turn this on. Highlighter. Let's see if it works. Okay, we're good. Yeah, so be Mary and Joseph for just a moment. What would that be like? It's not that they didn't know who Jesus was. They were, and I'll get to this one more time, but they were told. They were told in Luke chapter 1, verse 32, he's the Son of the Most High. They're told in Luke 1, verse 35, he is the Son of God. And they lost him. That would be really traumatic, and it was for them. So with that, we began this reading of about 13 verses, and just want to note something. Luke 2:40 and Luke 2:52 are bookends. And look at the similarities. They begin the episode and they finish the episode. And notice something. It says that the child Jesus continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom. And the grace of God was upon him. Then 52, and Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. You ever heard this? Because I've heard it in a local church that I was a member of years ago, that Jesus was 100% God and 100% human. Ever hear that? I've heard it on the radio or YouTube or whatever I listen to. 100% human, 100% deity. We're going to challenge that. It's not what the Bible teaches right here. If you look at this, so God is. There are three words that aren't in the Bible. I think the concept is omniscience means he knows everything. Omnipresent, he's everywhere. And I just forgot, an omnipotent, I think it's called, where he's unlimited something like that. I can see Lisa word it for me. But anyway, was he 100% God and 100% human while he was on the earth? Well, if he was, then how come he kept increasing in wisdom? God knows everything. And this was written 240 right after they dedicated when he was 40 days old. They moved to Galilee, Bethlehem, and then to Egypt. And then Luke 2:52 is written when he's 12 years old, and he's still increasing in wisdom. Is he 100% God on earth? Was he? And 100% man at the same time? Well, he had the form of God in some sense. He was completely God at one time. God is all power, all wisdom, deity in every way, as Jesus was. And notice something. In Philippians 2:6, this one who was in the form of God, that means he was God in every single way. He was morphe, in the form of God, in his nature, in his power, in his authority, in his wisdom, in his values, all his thoughts, God. Deity, completely, when he was in heaven. But it says that he didn't regard equality with God the Father, that's what it's talking about. He didn't regard equality with God the Father, something to be held on to. I'm not letting go. I want to stay here and be equal with you. And he didn't regard equality with God the Father to be something to be clung to, because he had an important mission that they planned before they made the earth, and that's to save us. And so it says, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of man. If he was 100% God and he emptied himself, what did he empty himself of? Is he still 100% God if he emptied himself of some of it? Because when he became in the likeness of a man, he wasn't omnipresent anymore. He wasn't everywhere. He was in one body. It says that he was increasing in wisdom from early childhood through 12 years old. That means he didn't have the omniscience, all the knowledge that God does. He's learning while he's on earth. So he must have emptied himself of a certain amount of authority, of power, of privileges, of course. But he emptied himself, and that means something. God shares this with us, that it was a great sacrifice. And if he didn't empty himself, then he couldn't increase in wisdom because he would have it all. His spirit was still eternal. It could not be killed. But his body could be, just as our body can be killed. And just as our spirit is eternal. But he became like us. And the Bible never says he was 100% God. He was the Son of God. That meant he had the nature of God. He had the righteousness of God. He had the love of God. He had the same values as God. What God thought was good, so did Jesus. But he emptied himself of certain things before he came to earth. He gave up his ability to know all things. So one more kind of supportive scripture here. It says in John 1:1, in the beginning. Now this is, in this case, I think if you study it out, it's way before he made anything. This is like there was no time before the beginning. It was like here he was with God, and before that he was with, in the beginning, it says, was the Word. That's Jesus, we'll see. And the Word was with God, the Father, and the Word was God. That means deity, divinity, a creator. If we read verse 3, we see that everything that was created through him, and nothing that was created without him. He was the creator. And so we see that the Word was God. Well, how do we know the Word's really Jesus? Because 14 verses later, it says, and the Word became flesh, just like Philippians 2:7 says. He emptied himself and became in the likeness of a man. 1 John 1:14 says, the Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelled among us, and we saw his glory. Now, we didn't in person, but the Apostle John, who wrote this book, said, we saw his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So he became a man, came into flesh, gave up some of his divine nature. And so, as I put this together, and I kind of wondered by Thursday afternoon if I should change tact here. I ran into some challenges, but how can a human being describe the divine nature? How can I talk about God with any kind of authority at all, except for the little bit that God reveals to us? I mean, it's challenging. So I'm sharing with you what the Word says. He emptied himself. He became flesh. But I can't give you much more than that. It's way over my head. Can't completely understand it. So we're just staying with the Word. All right. So in James 1:13, another evidence that Jesus was no longer 100% divinity, 100% God on earth, it says this in James 1:13. It says, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil. And it goes on to say, and God doesn't tempt anyone. The tempter does. But James 1:13, the key we want to look at is this. God cannot be tempted. And yet Jesus was. Hebrews 4:14, Jesus, the Son of God. Well, it's talking about, I just cut into the half of verse 14. Speaking of Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession that he is the Son of God. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, key, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are. That's one of the things that made his life meaningful. When we pray, we can't go, but Jesus, you just don't understand. You don't know how strong that temptation is, to take another hit of that or to indulge in this. You don't know. No, he does. He was tempted in all things because he became a man, still the Son of God, still the essence of God within him and his values. But he was a human being. He bled. And he was eventually killed. So wanted to point that out, that he was the Son of God, but he gave up some of his divine nature to come down and save us. All right, now let's go back to the text here. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. Now just so you know, Passover was based on God delivering the Egyptians, the Israelites out of Egypt. And the angel of death passed over every house that had the blood of the lamb on it. Won't go into detail, but it was to be celebrated every year. But not only that, but then they really had a week of the unleavened bread feast. It was, one day was the formal Passover, but it was 8-day celebration altogether. And many Jews came just for the Passover, but not all 8 days. That's what I read anyway. I wasn't back there then. But Jesus' parents, who had been poor, don't know if they still are, they went to Jerusalem every day at great expense. About an 80-mile walk, so 4 or 5 days. Then they stayed the full days, we'll see later, for 8 more days, and they got to go back home. No income, no unemployment back then. So they lost the work, and they had the expenses. But these two people loved God. Joseph and Mary were so faithful. That's why God clearly chose them to raise Jesus. And God says, he calls Joseph a righteous man in Matthew 1. He calls Mary righteous and a favored one in Luke chapter 1. Anyway, they went to the feast. And this time, when Jesus became 12, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. So they took Jesus with them. Now, women didn't even have to go. The law required all the men go, but Mary loved God. So she went, even though it was voluntary, and Jesus went. And he didn't have to go. He was only 12 years old. So I asked myself, and you should ask yourself, who cares? What's the significance of 12 years old? And some might say, as I would have a few weeks ago, oh, that's the bar mitzvah, right? When the Jews were raising a boy, maybe Victor's age or Zayden's age, and when they became 12, they got one more year to go before they're sons of the law. I didn't write it up there, but bar mitzvah. Bar means son of, and mitzvah means the commandment. So the Jews have this today. You've probably heard of it. Bar mitzvah is when a boy becomes a man in the Jewish religion at 13. Oh, that's not according to the Bible. That's just Jewish tradition. There was no bar mitzvah back then. From my studies, I put some time into it, and it kind of became formalized in the Middle Ages, so over 1,000 years after Jesus was gone. But so you might think, well, that's why. No, it wasn't bar mitzvah. He was just an amazing young man. He was an amazing young man. And so I'm asking, why would God tell us the age? All Scripture is valuable. All Scripture, according to 1 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired and profitable. So why is this profitable? Well, I'm going to have to guess. I'm guessing that we're told he became 12, maybe having to do with the age of accountability, when a person becomes guilty for their sins. Maybe that's why we're given the age, and because I think we're going to see he's definitely accountable now to God, and he wants to be. He chooses to be. So, show you a couple things here. Romans 4:15 says, "For the law brings about wrath." Well, really, the sin that people don't keep brings about wrath. But the law brings about wrath. But where there is no law, you can't violate it, right? There's no violation. So where there's no law, there's no violation. You can't sin if there's no law. All right, next verse. There's several, but I'm only going to look at two. Romans 7:19. Paul wrote this. And Paul the apostle said this. He said, "I was once alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, sin became alive and I died. When Paul was born, the law existed. It had existed for 1,500 years. But he says, I was once alive apart from the law. How could that be? The only way that can be is if infants and children are not accountable to the law. So he said, I was once alive apart from the law, even though he was circumcised on the 8th day. According to other scriptures, he was alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, what does that mean? When God says, okay, so Paul, you've been around it enough. You've read it enough. You understand the law. My law, God is saying, you're accountable. And when the commandment came, since no one could keep it perfectly, Paul or Saul sinned. Sin became alive and I died. So why am I showing you this? Because there is an age of accountability, and I've had a lot of Christians, not necessarily here, ask about what's the age of accountability? When does God say, okay, you're now guilty of your sin. You're old enough. You understand? You need to get rid of your sin or you're lost. When does that happen? So we're going to look at that idea a little bit. But there is a time, as I put up here on the top, there's a time in a person's life when they are not accountable to God. They're not under law. Too young. So when do we become accountable? Do we become accountable when we're an adult or sooner than that? Well, let's look at a couple of scriptures. Numbers 1, 2, and 3. God is telling Moses to take a census, count all the people of the congregation of the sons of Israel by their families, by their father's household, according to the number of names, every male, head by, so only males, by the way, and no Levite males, head by head from 20 years old and upward, if whoever is able to go out to war. So if a man is capable of fighting in a war for God, and he's at least 20 years old, he's an adult according to God. God never mentions the bar mitzvah or being an adult when you're 13. The same age for females. It says, this is kind of tricky, so I'll just keep it simple. People would make difficult vows. I swear by such and such that I will do such and such. I won't eat sugar for a year, whatever. But people make difficult vows, and there was an evaluation for them. And I think an evaluation for vow means this. You are worth so much in the evaluation. And so they would value males and female. But if it's a female, evaluation of a difficult law, stick with me just a second. I think you'll get it. If it's a female, then the valuation shall be 30 shekels. 30 shekels. But verse 5, if it be from 5 even to 20 years old, so if it's a younger female, not an adult female here, 30 shekels the evaluation. But if the female is 5 to 20 years old, then the female is 10 shekels. I'm just showing you that God considers adults, at least in the Old Testament, to be 20 years old or older. Is that when we're accountable to God? That's the question. Well, God does not give us an age, and this is no accident, by the way. No accident. It probably varies from person to person. There might be someone in here, and there are, that are 12, 13, and 14 years old. Maybe some of our early young teens are accountable to God right now, and maybe they're not. God does not tell us how we can know. He knows. But when their heart becomes accountable is when they know enough to get right with God, and they're accountable. And so check this out. I'm saying that he doesn't give an age, but it's not an adult because of 2 Kings 2:23. Then this is Elisha. Elijah, if you read the earlier part of the chapter, Elijah, the great prophet Elijah, was caught up in a whirlwind up into heaven. Only two people didn't die on earth. They were just taken up. Elijah was one of them. So he'd just been taken up, and look at what happens. Then Elisha, went up from there to Bethel. As he did, and as he was going up by the way, young lads, whenever we see the word youth, or we see the word lad in the Bible, it means they're not 20 years old yet. When David killed Goliath, Saul said, you're just a youth. And he's been a warrior from the time of his youth. And Joseph, in Genesis 37, when he was 17 years old, it says he was a youth. So if you're a youth, you're not an adult, or if you're a lad, you're not an adult. Look at what happens here. Young lads, youths, came out from the city and mocked him. They mocked the prophet of God and said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." What they mean by go up is do what Elijah did. Go on. We want to watch you go up to heaven just like your master, your mentor did. When you insult a prophet of God, and they knew he was a prophet, we insult God. We insult his spokesperson, his representative. We're directly insulting God himself. So they're insulting a great prophet of God. And it says, when he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. The 2 bears mauled, there were a lot of them, apparently, and they mauled 42 of them. What's the point here? It is this. They weren't adults, but they were accountable. God sent a curse on them with these 2 bears because they were old enough to know better. And so he mauled a good number of them because of their disrespect towards God himself, because they disrespected his prophet. All right. So what's the age that when we are held accountable? By the way, who needs this? Well, anybody here that is not a Christian and anybody here that's under 20 years old. We need to know. But it's not as easy as just coming up with a figure. But also the parents of the young people need to know. You need to know the answer, of course, but so do the grandparents. And probably, even you older geezers like me, Harold, you probably know a few young people, even if they're not your grandchildren. And so, really, we need to know because we need to have an answer ready sometime. And we don't have an exact answer. We just know you don't have to be an adult. There's sometime between 12, when Jesus is mentioned, and adulthood, when we're accountable. And I believe it varies from person to person. Depends upon how they were raised, intellectual capacity, how much they've been exposed to God's word. There's a whole bunch of factors. And isn't it good that God didn't tell us? Imagine he said, okay, when you're 13 and a half years old, you're accountable. Imagine the pressure the kids feel. And imagine the pressure the parents are put. You got to get baptized, man. You're 2 weeks away from... He didn't tell us. And he has good reason not to. So, moving on. So we don't know the age of accountability, but it has to do with the person's heart, the love for God. Some of you, I don't remember who, but I know some of you were baptized at a pretty early age. And so what happens if a person is baptized and they're not accountable yet? What happens if a person is baptized and they've never sinned before? Well, didn't that happen to Jesus? Jesus had never sinned. He goes to John the Baptist to be baptized. John tries to prevent him. And Jesus says, Matthew 3:15, but Jesus answering John, permitted at this time, for in this way it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. So if someone in here does get baptized, maybe before they reach the age of accountability, or was in the past baptized, was your heart right? You do it for the right reason? You think you understood what you were doing? You were making a covenant with God, because that's what baptism is. It says we're circumcised without hands in Colossians chapter 2. When we're baptized, circumcision is a covenant with God. So just like Jesus, if you wanted to because you love God and you stick with him, as far as I understand, your baptism is good, because God doesn't define the date that you need baptized. Done for the right reason and in a biblical way. Seems to me that Everything is good. All right. So let's go back to our text here. Luke 2:43. And as they were returning, that's Mary and Joseph in the caravan they were in, after spending the full number of days, that's all 8 days in Jerusalem, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware of it. This is the caravan, lots of big people, and just, is that realistic? If you study Jesus in the next few verses, you're going to see that we realize he's very reliable, very spiritually minded, very mature for his age. Wait till we get to what was already read for us right there. But they trusted him. And they came in a caravan where you got to fellowship with the people, your neighbors and so forth, as you're walking back the 80 miles. And they just trusted him because of his maturity, obviously. His parents weren't aware that he wasn't with them. They just supposed he was in the caravan because that's the kind of young man Jesus was. And they went, and they went a day's journey, and they began looking for him among their, hey, have you seen Jesus? We're looking for our son. Did he travel with your family? Have you seen our son Jesus? Must have been a pretty good-sized caravan, but they looked for him on the relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. I mean, they have natural love. These are two holy people, two righteous people. They've got natural love for their son. And they've left behind the Son of God. How does God feel about that? They might have been asking themselves. What have we done? Is he okay? Is he alive? So they did not find him. They returned to Jerusalem looking for him. Then after 3 days, they found him in the temple. Now, I don't know if that's travel time. You just can't tell from the Greek. But they were without him a minimum of 3 days. And they find him in the temple. Not a likely place for 12-year-old kids. Sitting in the midst of teachers, both listening to them and asking questions. I love that. He's sitting with mature people. He's from a small town, Nazareth, probably doesn't have access to a lot of Bible scholars. Here he is in Jerusalem with some of the big minds of the day. He's sitting with them, he's listening, he's asking them questions. We'll see he's also answering questions in just a moment. Well, still, why didn't he go when everyone else did? There's a couple of possibilities. I'm going to give you my best shot. Maybe Joseph says to his cousin, hey, could you tell Jesus we're taking off in a couple of hours? Sure. Okay, I told him. Maybe they had a pre-planned time and date. We're leaving on Monday at noon. Be there. Be at the Solomon's porch in the temple. Everybody agrees to it. Whatever. Maybe they didn't have a direct conversation with him. We don't know. But we're going to move on just a little bit. No, we're not. We're going to stay here just a second. It looks to me like Jesus chose not to go. Not in rebellion. We'll see that in just a minute. It looks to me like he chose not to go. How come? You think this could have happened? He's in the temple, maybe making his way towards Solomon, and he sees a beggar that's crying for help. Could you help me? Could you read me from the Torah, from the Jewish Bible? No one ever takes the time to read to me. Could you do that for me, please? He could hear Jesus walk by. Maybe he's in a conversation and hearing somebody he's never heard before, because Jesus said in the Beatitudes, Matthew 6:6, blessed is he who hungers and thirsts for righteousness. I've got to have more. I want that to be who I am. I want to be a child of God. I want to be more holy. Maybe he's ready to leave and he hears a guy talking and he goes, I've never heard this before. I've never heard this discussion before. I've got to stay. I crave righteousness. No cell phones back then. Sorry, Mom, Dad. There could have been a lot of different scenarios why Jesus didn't go. But clearly we're going to see it was a choice not to go. A choice not to go. So he's sitting with these teachers, listening, asking them questions, and it says all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Amazed is a pretty strong word, but the Greek word is stronger. The Greek word is, this is the Greek dictionary called Bauer, Danker, Art, and Gingrich. It says, to be amazed, to be astonished, of the feeling of an astonishment mingled with fear. They're listening to Jesus. No 12-year-old knows this stuff. How could he? I didn't know that. Where did he get this wisdom? And this astonishment mingled with fear. And Ioannidis gives pretty much the same identical definition right here. So they're amazed, to say the very least. And then when his parents, Joseph and Mary, saw Jesus, they were astonished. Almost the same word, but not quite. They were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated her this way? She's upset, as I would be. My 12-year-old doesn't go with me." And I made it clear, probably. She's upset. And then she goes on to make him feel bad. She says, "Your father, why have you treated this way? It was wrong," she's saying. "And then we've been anxiously looking for you, looking with great fear, great consternation, just uptight, anxiously looking for you. How could you do this?" Almost the same word, amazement to the point of being overwhelmed and dumbfounded. What were they dumbfounded? This is his parents. What were they dumbfounded about or overwhelmed about? We don't know. Maybe it was what he was saying, but most likely it was, "You're in the temple? We looked at the playgrounds, the swimming holes, the bakery, your aunts and uncles. You're in the temple with all these older men?" I think that's it. And they're blown away. They're blown away. But look at his response. He said to them, his parents, "Why is it that you were looking for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? I had to be doing my Father's business?" It wasn't like there was a choice here. It seems to me that at this moment, or within the previous few days, Jesus comes to a conclusion of something. Look at the comparison of words. Mary says, "Your father and I have been," and Jesus says, "my Father's house." He has an earthly father and God the Father. I think he's reached the age of accountability, my guess. But look at his maturity. They're blown away. Everybody's blown away at his answers, at his knowledge. Certainly he's accountable now. And he said, "I had to be here. Either this guy needed help, or this guy was doing some false teaching I had to correct. Whatever it was. Didn't you know I had to be here? In other words, why did you even look in the other places? I've been living with you for 12 years. You know me." And they did, and they trusted him. That's why they weren't overly henpecking and making sure he got in the caravan. So he's making this choice. He knows now who his real father is. I don't know when he learned that, but it's really apparent that he knows it now, and what it's going to mean, that God is his father, what it means for his life and his mission. But they did not understand the statement which he had made to them. By the way, Lisa and I were bothered deeply, and we found our daughter pretty quickly. But before Mary experienced this traumatic incident, a prophet in Luke 1 by the name of Simeon, Luke by the name of Simeon, blessed them and blessed Jesus. And here's what Simeon said, because this is what happened. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, "Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and the rise of many in Israel, and for a sign to be opposed." That doesn't sound real peaceful, but that's what he's appointed to do, for the fall and rise of many in Israel, and a sign to be opposed. And then he says in verse 35, "And a sword will pierce even your own soul, Mary." He doesn't say Mary, but it says he's saying this to Mary. "A sword will even pierce your own soul, to the end that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed." Perhaps her heart is starting to get pierced already, thinking that she lost her child, who just happened to be the Son of God as well, because she was definitely distraught. Maybe that was the beginning of the prophecy. Maybe it didn't happen to the cross. We're just not told for sure. But he chose this. He chose to do what was right. I feel tremendously challenged by this, by his devotion to God and learning as much as he can. You know, blessed are those who thirst and hunger for righteousness, they shall be satisfied. I feel very challenged by that when I see his action. And we're not talking about a loss of balance. If you're a father or a mother or child, you have other obligations than just reading your Bible. We're not denying that for a second. But we are talking about priority here. We are talking about what is ultimate in our lives. And parents, and most of you are either parents or grandparents, parents, isn't this the kind of thing we want to teach our children? To spend some time. Look, you can play with your friends a lot, but spend some time with some more mature people. Visit with them in the building. Or let's have lunch with them and sit and listen and ask them questions and thirst for the knowledge that older people typically have. What a great life principle to teach our children. Whether you're married and haven't yet or not, we want that to be their mindset, to grow and be pleasing to God. And so, was he in sin? He never sinned, but his mom was mad at him. Did he sin by not going when they went? Well, look at the scriptures. It says in verse 51, he went down with them, because Jerusalem was up on a mountain. So even though it's going north, he went down to Galilee. So he went in Nazareth. He went down with him and came to Nazareth, and he continued. What does that mean? Continued in subjection would mean he never stopped. He's always been in subjection because he's the perfect son. But now he has to make a choice sometimes. God or family. He was always in subjection. We'll read about it again when he's in his 30s and how much he loved his mother and took care of her when he was dying on the cross, made sure she was in good hands. But he never was out of subjection. So whatever reason he had for staying there in Jerusalem was a good one, because he knew that's what God wanted him to do. And Simeon warned her, listen, a sword's going to even pierce your own heart. There'll be some surprises that you won't like, but you're raising the Son of God. And just so you know, parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, you're raising sons of God. Any person who becomes a Christian becomes a son of God, child of God, Galatians chapter 3. And they may not be there yet, but that's our goal in raising children. Is we're not really raising children, we're raising adults. That's our job as parents, to teach them life lessons, and as they get older, give them more responsibility like Mary and Joseph did Jesus. And they'll blow it sometime, but that's part of raising adults, is letting them grow and learn as Jesus as we read in verse 40 and 52, kept increasing in wisdom. That's our lesson for today. A different kind of lesson than normal, but I hope it had some value to you, that we can appreciate Jesus a little bit more. He was God. He emptied himself, to what point I don't know, and came to earth, gave up some of his divine attributes so he could die, so he could be tempted, so he could sacrifice himself for our good. What a Savior. At this time, I'll just invite anybody that has a spiritual need to let us know what it is. We're going to stand in a moment and sing the song of invitation. If you'd like some prayers, let me know, or one of the elders. If you'd like to become a Christian today, that would give us great joy. So please stand while we sing the song of invitation.